The day Ezekiel Rhodes rode into Clearwater, Texas, the autumn sky was the color of a bruise healing at its edges, and he had absolutely no intention of staying. He had not intended to stay anywhere in 11 years. That was the plain and simple truth of it, a truth so worn smooth from being carried around that it had stopped feeling like a wound and had started feeling like skin. 11 years of dust roads and campfire smoke, of sleeping under stars that looked different every 100 miles, of waking up in the gray hour before dawn with the same hollow ache in his chest and the same automatic reach for his hat on whatever surface was nearest. 11 years since he had watched everything that anchored him to the earth burn down to nothing in a single terrible night, and he had simply pointed his horse in whatever direction the wind was blowing and told himself he would stop when he found a reason. He had not found one yet. His horse, a broad-chested roan named Cinder, who was nearly as road-weary as his rider, plodded along the main street of Clearwater with the resigned patience of an animal who had long since stopped expecting to sleep in the same place twice. The town was modest but solid, the kind of settlement that had survived the worst of the frontier years and was starting to think about its future. It was the year 1883, and the railroad had reached a dozen Texas towns in the last few seasons, stitching the wild land together thread by thread. Clearwater was not yet on that line, but the people here spoke about it with a particular hungry optimism, like a man watching storm clouds and deciding to call it rain before it arrives. Ezekiel was 34 years old. His face showed most of those years honestly. The sun-browned skin creased at the corners of dark eyes that had seen enough to make him careful about what they rested on. He wore a battered hat the color of creek mud, a canvas duster that had once been brown and was now simply the color of roads, and he carried a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver on his hip with the practical indifference of a man who has worn iron so long it no longer feels like a choice. He pulled Cinder up in front of the livery stable and swung down, his boots raising a small cloud of October dust. He was only stopping for water and grain for the horse. That was all. He had told himself this in the last 9 towns, and in 8 of those 9 he had been right. He intended to be right again. The livery hand, a boy of about 15 who was sweeping hay with more enthusiasm than skill, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Cost you 2 bits for the night, mister. 4 bits if you want him brushed down proper." Ezekiel handed over 2 bits without bargaining and told the boy to give Cinder water and oats. Then he walked across the street toward the saloon, not because he intended to drink heavily, but because a saloon was the place in any western town where a man could sit quietly in a corner and not be asked too many questions. He was nearly at the door when it happened. A sound split the dry October air like a stone through glass. It was the sound of a woman, and it was not a scream of fear exactly, though fear was threaded through it. It was the sound of someone who had been pushed past the limit of composure and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. "You take your hand off my wagon, Mr. Denton, or I promise you the next thing I reach for will not be words." Ezekiel stopped walking. He was not a man who inserted himself into other people's troubles. That was another piece of him that had worn smooth over 11 years, the instinct toward involvement. He had learned, more than once and in more ways than one, that caring about things that were not yours to care about was a direct road to the kind of pain that did not heal into anything useful. He knew this. He turned around anyway. Down the block and across the street, in front of a dry goods store whose painted sign read TOWNSEND General Mercantile, a woman stood beside a wagon loaded with supply crates. She was facing down 2 men with the particular body language of someone who is afraid, but has decided that being afraid is not going to change anything, so it might as well be ignored. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical hat, wearing a blue calico dress that had seen hard work but was clean. In her right hand she held a wooden-handled axe, not raised but present, her knuckles white around the grip. The man she had called Mr. Denton was thick through the shoulders, florid-faced, and wearing the particular expression of a man who was accustomed to getting his way in small towns, because everyone around him found it easier to let him. The second man stood slightly behind, doing what second men in these situations always did, which was providing bulk without taking individual responsibility. "Now, Miss Townsend," Denton was saying, his voice carrying the street with the ease of a man who liked the sound of his own authority, "all I am telling you is that your daddy's debt came due last month, and since your daddy is no longer in a position to pay it himself, the arrangement passes to you. That is how it works. I did not make those rules." "My father's debts were settled when we sold the east pasture," the woman said, and her voice was steady in a way that cost her something. Ezekiel could hear the cost. "I have the paperwork, and I will show it to the sheriff if you do not step back from this wagon." "Sheriff Calloway is a busy man," Denton said, and smiled in a way that told Ezekiel everything about the relationship between Denton and the sheriff without another word being necessary. Ezekiel had stopped planning to intervene. He had started moving. He crossed the street with no particular hurry, because hurry communicated alarm, and alarm made situations like this unpredictable. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried ease of a man who has navigated enough of these moments to know that the tone you set in the first 3 seconds either diffuses things or accelerates them. He came up beside the woman and slightly in front of her without looking at her, his eyes settling on Denton with a quality of attention that was not aggressive but was absolutely unmistakable in its intent. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly. Denton looked at him with the instinctive appraisal of a man who has spent years calculating threats. What he saw in Ezekiel Rhodes was not a man who was posturing. He was not leaning into his gun or squaring his shoulders. He was simply present with the particular stillness of someone who had nothing to prove and no desire to prove it, and that, Ezekiel had learned over 11 years of drifting through dangerous situations, was the thing that made men like Denton hesitate. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Denton said. "Probably not," Ezekiel agreed. "But here I am. You were just leaving, I think." There was a long moment. The second man shifted his weight. Denton looked at Ezekiel one more time, measuring something, and then looked away, which told both of them everything about how the measuring had come out. "We'll finish this conversation another time, Miss Townsend," Denton said. "I look forward to it," she said, and her voice had lost none of its steel. They walked away. Ezekiel watched them go until they turned a corner, and then he let the breath out of his chest that he had not entirely been aware of holding. He turned to look at the woman for the first time directly and found her already looking at him. Her eyes were hazel. Not hazel the color, the name of a tree, but the actual layered complexity of what that word meant when applied to eyes. Amber at the center fading to green at the edges, with a dark ring around the iris like the border of a map. They were remarkable eyes, and they were looking at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and suspicion, which Ezekiel thought showed good sense. "I had it handled," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You did." A pause. She studied him the way women on the frontier had learned to study strangers, quickly and thoroughly, looking for the information that mattered. "I'm Hazel Townsend," she said finally. "This is my store." "Ezekiel Rhodes," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "You're passing through." It was not a question. She said it with the particular tone of someone who was identifying a fact that had already shaped her response to the situation. Ezekiel noticed this and found that it did something unexpected to the hollow place in his chest, a small, sharp sensation like cold water on a numb limb. "I am," he said. "Well, Mr. Rhodes," she said, and she bent and picked up one of the supply crates from the wagon bed as though the last 5 minutes had simply been an interruption. "I am grateful for the assistance, passing through or not. Can I offer you a meal? I was just about to bring these inside and start supper." He was going to say no. He had the word formed, had his hat half raised for a polite departure, when she lifted the second crate and one of them shifted in her arms, and without thinking he stepped forward and took it from her. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange, her fingers warm against his, and he felt the contact with a clarity that surprised him. "I can carry these inside," he said instead. She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but the beginning of one, the kind that gets interrupted. "Supper is at 6, she said. "The store closes at 5. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and Ezekiel Rhodes carried the crates inside. The inside of Townsend General Mercantile smelled of flour and pine resin and dried herbs tied in bundles along one wall, and there was a quality of ordered industry about it that told him the woman who ran it was serious about her work. The shelves were well stocked and well labeled. The counter was clean. There was a glass case near the register that held small personal items, combs and hand mirrors and a few pieces of modest jewelry, and beside it a ledger that was open to the current month's accounts, the columns filled in with a firm, clear hand. He set the crates down where she directed and looked around with the automatic inventory of a man who has spent years reading spaces for what they tell him about the people who inhabit them. "Your father owned this before you," he said. It was not a guess. The name on the sign was worn in a way that spoke of years, and the newer paint around the letters told him it had been freshened recently, maintained rather than replaced. She was already behind the counter, starting to sort through the contents of the crates. He died in the spring, Hart. She said it simply without asking for any particular response, and he respected that. "I'm sorry," he said. "He was a good man," she said. "He worked hard his whole life and left me something real. I intend to keep it real." She looked up at him then. "That is what Denton wants, the building, not the store. He wants to turn the whole block into something that suits him, and my father's debt was the tool he thought he had to make that happen. But the debt is settled. I have the documentation." "Have you shown the sheriff?" Something shifted in her expression. "Sheriff Calloway and Roy Denton drink together on Friday evenings." "I have not found that showing the sheriff things achieves much. I have written to the county seat." "That was the right move," Ezekiel said. "I know it was," she said, with a directness that made him want to smile. He helped her unpack the crates without being asked. They worked in a comfortable quiet for a while, and he noticed that she did not fill the silence with nervous talk the way some people did. She was comfortable in it, which made him comfortable in it, which was not a thing he was used to anymore. At 5 o'clock she turned the sign on the door and led him through a door at the back of the store into the attached living quarters. A kitchen and 2 rooms that were small but meticulously maintained, every surface holding something useful. She had a wood stove, and she built it up with the ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood, and within a short time the smell of bacon and cornbread was filling the space. "Where are you headed?" she asked, not turning from the stove. "South," he said, which was the direction he had most recently decided on, selected with no more deliberation than a man choosing which pocket to put his change in. "What's south?" "I haven't gotten there yet." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been traveling?" He considered lying. It was an automatic instinct, the instinct of a man who had learned that honesty about his situation invited questions he did not want to answer. But something about the steadiness of this woman, her kitchen, the smell of her supper cooking, made the usual instinct feel shabby. 11 years, he said. She turned from the stove then and looked at him, and there was no pity in it, only the careful attention of someone who is actually listening. "What happened 11 years ago?" she asked. He had not talked about it in probably 6 years. The last time had been with a bartender in New Mexico who had asked a similar question, and he had told the man enough to make the bartender pour him a second whiskey, and then they had both been very quiet, which was the appropriate response. "I had a place," he said. "A small ranch east of San Antonio. My wife and I built it together. We were starting a life." He paused. "A grass fire came through in a dry July. It moved too fast. She couldn't get out." Hazel did not say she was sorry, not immediately, not with the reflexive condolence that people reached for because they did not know what else to offer. She just held his gaze for a moment with those remarkable hazel eyes and then turned back to the stove. "Her name," she said quietly. "Clara," he said. And that was all, and somehow that was exactly right. And he felt something in his chest shift the way a stone shifts in a streambed when the water finally moves it. They ate supper at a small table beside the kitchen window. The October evening settled blue and cold against the glass, and the lamp between them threw warm light across her face and her hands, which were capable and sure, the hands of a woman who did real work. She told him about Clearwater, about her father building the store in 1861, when the town was barely more than a crossroads, about the years of drought and the years of cattle drives passing through and leaving the streets loud and the coffers briefly full. She told him about the way things were changing now, the new people coming through on their way west who sometimes stayed, the way the railroad's approach was beginning to make people argue about what kind of town they wanted to be. He told her about places he had been: New Mexico, Arizona Territory, Colorado Indian Territory. He had driven cattle, worked mines, done carpentry, fixed fences, done a season as a deputy in a small Oklahoma town that had since been absorbed by a larger one. He said all of this carefully, aware that he was offering her a map of 11 years of nothing stopping him, and that she was receiving it with understanding rather than judgment. After supper she poured coffee and they sat a while longer, and Ezekiel was aware, in a way that registered at some deep level below thought, that he had not been this comfortable in a room with another person in a very long time. Maybe ever, in a way that he could name while it was happening. With Clara it had been different. It had been the comfort of two people building something together. This was the comfort of two people who were each other's unexpected weather, surprising and clear. "You can sleep in the storeroom tonight," she said, when the lamp was burning low. "It's cold and your horse is already at the livery." "That's kind," he said. "I'll be gone by first light." She looked at him for a moment across the table. "I know," she said. He lay on a bedroll in the storeroom with the smell of flour and dry wood around him, and the sound of the October wind working its way through the eaves, and he stared at the dark ceiling for a long time before sleep came. He thought about the way she had asked Clara's name. He thought about the shape of her hands when she poured the coffee. He thought about the axe handle white-knuckled in her grip when she faced Denton down, and the particular quality of courage it took to be afraid and carry on anyway. He was awake before dawn, as he always was. He lay still in the gray light, listening to the town around him, the distant sound of the livery, the creak of a shutter somewhere, the settling of the building he was in. He told himself to get up, get Cinder, and ride south. He lay there for another 10 minutes. He got up, folded the bedroll, and let himself quietly into the kitchen to stoke the stove before she woke, because it was cold and it was the least a man who had slept under her roof could do. He was laying in the wood when he heard her footsteps, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, her hair not yet pinned, falling over one shoulder in a dark auburn braid. They looked at each other in the gray light of very early morning. "Coffee's in the tin above the stove," she said, as naturally as if this were a thing they had been doing for years. He made the coffee. She came in and started on breakfast without making any comment about his continued presence, and he noticed this and recognized it as the grace it was. She was not asking him to stay. She was simply not closing the door before he walked through it himself. He stayed for breakfast. He told himself he would leave after breakfast. He told himself this while he helped her open the store, while he carried the heavier items she had been arranging by herself to the shelves where they belonged, while he fixed the loose hinge on the storeroom door that had been rattling every time the wind blew. He told himself this while he watched her measure out flour and dried beans for a woman who came in mid-morning with a baby on her hip and 2 children clinging to her skirts, and the way Hazel spoke to those children, dropping to their level and asking them about things that mattered to them, with a quality of attention that was total and genuine. At noon she brought sandwiches out from the back and sat on the bench outside the store to eat them, and he sat beside her, and the October sun was warm on their faces, and the street of Clearwater moved around them in its daily rhythm. "You haven't left yet," she said. "I haven't," he agreed. She looked at him sidelong. "The hinge on the back room door was rattling since August. I kept meaning to address it." "It needed a different screw," he said. "The old one had widened the hole." "I know." A pause. "There's a section of the porch railing around the side that's half rotted through. I've been meaning to replace it before someone puts their weight on it and goes through." He looked at her. She was eating her sandwich with the thoughtful attention of someone who was not looking at him, which meant she was very aware of him. "I could look at that," he said. "I would appreciate it," she said. He looked at that railing. He sourced the lumber from the mill at the edge of town and spent the afternoon working in the thin October sunshine, and Hazel brought him water twice and on the second time stayed to watch him work for a while, which he did not mind. He was aware of her the way you are aware of sunlight, not blindingly but continuously, as the source of warmth in the general atmosphere. In the late afternoon, Denton walked past on the opposite side of the street and looked at the store, and looked at Ezekiel working on the porch, and did not stop. But his look was the kind that meant he was cataloging, and Ezekiel met his eyes briefly and held them for just a moment before going back to work, and Denton moved on. That evening over supper she told him about the county seat letter. She had written to the land office 2 weeks ago and had not yet received a reply, and the lack of response was making her nervous. Denton had people in several offices, she explained, and she was not certain the letter had been received or acted on. "Do you have a copy of the debt settlement paperwork here?" he asked. "Of course. Let me look at it after supper." She set the papers in front of him, and he read them carefully by lamplight. He had spent enough years in enough towns watching the machinery of property and debt that he could read a legal document with reasonable competence. What he found was what she had told him. The debt had been settled clearly, documented in the handwriting of a third party with signatures from both her father and Denton, dated 6 months before her father's death. "This is solid," he said. "He has no legitimate claim, but he doesn't need a legitimate claim if he can muddy the water long enough. The goal would be to make the legal process complicated enough that you either give up or go under before it resolves." "I know that," she said quietly. "I know exactly what he's doing. Have you considered writing to a lawyer? There are a few in San Antonio who take cases by correspondence." "I can't afford a lawyer," she said, plainly and without embarrassment. "The store does well enough to run, but not well enough to throw money at legal fees on top of everything else." He looked at the papers for a moment. "I can write the letter to San Antonio on your behalf. I've done enough correspondence of this kind that I know what they'll need to hear. And I'll write a second letter to the county land office directly, not through the general mail, through the postal registry, which costs a nickel more but creates a receipt you can use as documentation of contact." She looked at him across the table. "You know a great deal for a man who has been drifting for 11 years. Drifting doesn't mean not paying attention," he said. "It just means you don't stay." That landed on the air between them for a moment, honest and a little sad. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept that help." He wrote both letters that evening at her kitchen table, by lamplight, with her sitting across from him sewing a tear in a work apron. The sound of the needle through cloth and the scratch of the pen on paper were oddly harmonious, and every so often she would look up, and he would be reading what he had written and she would look back down, and neither of them said anything, and the evening was one of the most peaceful Ezekiel could remember since Clara. He slept in the storeroom again. This time he did not lie awake telling himself to leave. He simply lay there in the dark and thought about the fact that he was still here, and found that this fact, rather than making him feel trapped or restless the way he might have expected, felt instead like something that had been offered and accepted without either of them making a formal declaration about it. Wednesday, he mailed the letters. He also stopped by the telegraph office and sent a brief wire to a contact he had made years ago in Austin, a man named Patterson who worked in the state land office, and owed Ezekiel a professional courtesy from a situation 3 years back involving a land dispute and Ezekiel's willingness to testify in a civil proceeding. He did not tell Hazel about the wire. He did not want to offer her hope that might not materialize. He helped her through Wednesday and spent part of the afternoon doing an inventory of the stockroom that she had been too busy to complete, cataloging what was running low, and writing out a suggested order list in the same firm, clear hand he used for everything practical. He left the list on the counter without comment. She found it in the late afternoon when she was closing up, and he saw her look at it for a long moment and then look at him across the room. He was sweeping near the back door and pretended to be absorbed in it. "This is a thorough inventory," she said. "The nutmeg is nearly out," he said, "and the boot blacking." "I can see that," she said. He could hear the smile in it without turning around. Thursday morning a man came into the store who Ezekiel had not seen before, a rangy, weathered man in his 50s named Baxter who ran a cattle operation 10 miles south of town. Baxter greeted Hazel with obvious warmth and looked at Ezekiel with the thorough appraisal of a man deciding whether to be territorial. "Who's this?" Baxter said. "Ezekiel Rhodes," Hazel said. "He's been helping around the store this week." Passing through, Baxter asked Ezekiel directly. "I was," Ezekiel said. Baxter looked at him another moment and then seemed to reach some internal conclusion that was at least provisionally favorable. "Roy Denton's been telling people Miss Townsend is in financial trouble," he said to Hazel. "Getting ahead of the story. You should know people are hearing it." Hazel's jaw set in a way that Ezekiel was already learning meant she was furious but was choosing her response carefully. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'd be grateful if you would tell anyone who raises it with you that the Townsend Mercantile has settled accounts and is in good standing. I'll have documentation from the county land office within the week." She said the last part with a confidence she did not entirely have, and after Baxter left she looked at Ezekiel. "Will I?" she said quietly. "I think so," he said. "I sent a wire." She looked at him for a moment. "To whom?" "A man I know at the state land office in Austin. He'll verify the settlement registration and can send a formal confirmation. It carries more weight than the original documentation because it's a state record." She was quiet for several seconds. "You did that without asking me." "Yes," he said. "I should have told you I'm sorry." Another pause. He watched her consider him, and felt the particular vulnerability of having done something that was meant as help but might be received as presumption. "Don't do things like that without telling me again," she said. "But thank you." "Yes, ma'am," he said. That afternoon, walking back from the post office, they passed the church, a simple wooden building set back from the street with a cemetery behind it where the October grass had gone yellow and the trees were showing their bones through the thinning leaves. Hazel slowed without thinking about it, and Ezekiel slowed with her. "My father is buried there," she said. "Not 2 months yet." They stood at the low fence. The grave was marked with a stone that was simple but well made, the kind that would hold its letters through weather. "Thomas James Townsend," it read. 1831–1883. "A good man." "He was kind," she said. "That sounds small, but it wasn't. He was kind when it would have been easier not to be. He treated the Mexican families and the Negro families and the Comanche women who traded here the same way he treated the banker and the town council. Exactly the same. It cost him sometimes." "It was worth it," Ezekiel said. "It was worth it," she agreed. They stood there a moment more. The wind moved through the cemetery trees and a single red leaf detached and drifted across the graves. It was the kind of moment that exists in a space between ordinary time, and Ezekiel was aware of it with every part of him. "Do you have anyone buried anywhere?" she asked, not intrusively, the way you ask someone a question when you have already handed them something of yours and are offering them the space to do the same. "Clara is buried outside San Antonio," he said. "I went back once 2 years after. I put in a proper stone, then I left again. Do you want to go back someday?" He thought about this honestly. "I think she'd want me to stop running," he said. "I've had that thought for years. I just couldn't figure out where to land." Hazel turned and looked at him, and the afternoon light was in her eyes and on her hair, and she was so fully herself in this moment, alive and strong and a little sad, and not asking him for anything beyond honesty, that Ezekiel felt something move through his chest like the first warm air of spring moving through a house that has been shut up through a long winter. "I should start supper," she said softly. "I'll carry the flour," he said, and they walked back to the store together through the October afternoon. Friday brought trouble. It began with Roy Denton and Sheriff Calloway appearing in the store together, which was a deliberate staging of the kind that Ezekiel recognized immediately. Denton had a paper in his hand, and Calloway had the sheepish but determined look of a man who has been given a script and knows it's a bad one but is going to perform it anyway. "Miss Townsend," Calloway said, "I need to inform you that Mr. Denton has filed a formal complaint with the county court alleging irregular documentation in the property transfer records of this establishment." Hazel was behind the counter. She did not move. "Irregular in what way?" "That's for the court to determine," Denton said. "In the meantime, there may need to be an injunction on business operations pending." "There will be no injunction," said a voice from the doorway. All of them turned. In the doorway stood a man Ezekiel did not know but whose face registered sharply as someone carrying official authority. He was perhaps 60, in a dark traveling coat, carrying a leather satchel, and he had the look of a man who has come a long way on a purpose and is not interested in anything that delays that purpose. "My name is Alderman Crow," the man said, stepping inside. "I am a land registry examiner from the state office in Austin." "I received a wire from your office on Thursday, Mr. Rhodes." He looked at Ezekiel. "I apologize for the speed of my arrival. I was already traveling in this district for other matters. I stopped here first." Hazel turned and looked at Ezekiel. Her expression was something that he could not entirely read, but gratitude was in it, and a kind of surprised emotion that she was controlling carefully. Crow opened his satchel and produced a state-certified document. The settlement of all debts between the estate of Thomas Townsend and Mr. Roy Denton was registered with the county clerk on the 9th of April, 1883, and is reflected in the state land registry as of April 15th. The property and business known as Townsend General Mercantile is debt-free and in clear ownership of Miss Hazel Townsend. Any action to the contrary is without legal basis. He looked at Denton with the expression of a man who has done this particular kind of work for a long time and is entirely unmoved by the specific variety of dishonesty in front of him. "Mr. Denton," he said, "if you file that court complaint, I will personally ensure that the state land office's records are submitted in response, and I will note in my report that this complaint was filed with full knowledge of the settled registration. I suggest you save everyone's time." Denton's face went through several colors. He looked at Calloway, who was suddenly finding the floorboards very interesting. He looked at Hazel, and then he looked at Ezekiel, and what he saw in Ezekiel's eyes was still the same quality of unremarkable attention that had moved him on Tuesday, and it worked again. Denton left without speaking. Calloway followed him, looking like a man who had been given a lesson he would rather have avoided. Crow stayed long enough to have the coffee Hazel made him, and to confirm the paperwork details, and to be given a proper receipt for his visit. He was professional and efficient, and he shook Ezekiel's hand at the door with the firm grip of a man who appreciated having a wire sent at the right moment. When he was gone, Hazel closed the store door and turned around. She and Ezekiel were alone in the store. The Friday afternoon light came through the windows and lay in long golden panels across the wooden floor. The store smelled of coffee and flour and the faint wood smoke from the stove, and outside a dog was barking somewhere in the middle distance, and it was quiet. She crossed the room to him. He did not move toward her. He simply stood and let her come, because this felt like something she needed to own the approach of. She stopped a foot in front of him and looked up at him, and her eyes were very bright. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes," he said, because there was nothing else to say, and it answered the thing she was actually asking. And she put her arms around him, just that, an embrace, her face against his shoulder, and his arms came around her without hesitation. And they stood that way in the quiet store, while the October light moved across the floor, and Ezekiel Rhodes felt something in him that had been locked closed for 11 years open, with the ease of something that has simply been waiting for the right key. He pressed his face against the top of her head. She smelled of wood smoke and soap, and something warm underneath that was just her, distinctly and entirely her, and he held it. After a long moment she pulled back and looked up at him, and now she was actually crying a little, not much but enough to be honest about. "I have been holding all of this by myself since April," she said. "I know," he said. "I could see that. I wasn't looking for someone to save me," she said, and it was important to her that he understood this. "I was managing. I would have managed." "You would have," he said. "I don't doubt it for a second." But she started, and then stopped, and then looked at him with her remarkable eyes that were hazel and complicated and full of things she was deciding how to say. "I know," he said again, more quietly. She reached up and put one hand against his jaw, and the touch was so simple and so direct that it went through him like a clean note of music. "Don't leave yet," she said, not a command, the softest possible request. "I won't," he said. He meant it for a week. He told himself he meant it for a week. Saturday she showed him the rest of the town, walking him through it in the way someone walks a person they care about through a place they love, not as a guide but as a sharer. She showed him the mill and the church and the small school that had been built 3 years ago, and she showed him the wide flat plain at the edge of town, where the grass was autumn gold, and the sky went on forever, and the wind had a bite to it that sharpened everything. She told him about the teacher, a young woman from Ohio who had come out on her own initiative, and was doing remarkable work with the children of families who had never had schooling. She told him about old Mrs. Garza 2 streets over, who made the best tamales in 3 counties, and who had been Thomas Townsend's neighbor for 22 years, and who checked on Hazel every Sunday morning after church. He listened to all of it. He listened the way a man listens when he is building a picture of something, filling it in, letting it become real. Sunday they went to church, which surprised Ezekiel somewhat since he had not been inside a church voluntarily in several years. But it felt natural to walk with her there, and inside the simple building with the morning light through plain glass windows and the smell of pine boards and the neighbors singing with more heart than skill, he felt something he had forgotten existed, which was the feeling of belonging to a place by standing in it with someone. Mrs. Garza found him after service and looked him over with the directness of a woman in her 70s who has earned the right to say exactly what she thinks. "You are staying?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "You are not sure yet," she repeated, in a tone that suggested she found uncertainty a poor excuse in the presence of obvious evidence. She patted his arm and then turned to Hazel and said something in Spanish that made Hazel's cheeks go pink, which Ezekiel stored away with some satisfaction. Sunday evening after supper, he and Hazel sat on the front steps of the store in the cold dark, wrapped in coats, with coffee cups that had long gone cold. The stars over Texas were enormous, the way they always were in clear October, and the town was quiet around them. "Tell me something about the last 11 years, she said. Something that mattered, he thought about it. "A winter in Colorado," he said. "A mining camp outside Durango. A man there named Henry Coles, 60 years old, spent his whole life looking for a strike that never came. He'd been at it for 30 years, and he was happy. Not resigned, not pretending. Actually happy because every morning was still a possibility." "That's beautiful," she said softly. "I thought about him a lot after," Ezekiel said. "I had to figure out whether he had something I didn't or whether he'd just found a way to stop needing what I needed." "What did you need?" she asked. "Something to stay for," he said. The night held them in it. A coyote called somewhere far out on the plain, the particular wild, lonely sound of it carrying clearly in the cold air. "I'm 34 years old," he said after a while. "I have no property. I have a good horse and a rifle and skills that have kept me alive in useful ways for 11 years. That's the full account of it." She looked at him in the dark. "You think I'm calculating whether you're worth keeping around based on your inventory? I think any reasonable person would." "Ezekiel," she said patiently, "the way you say someone's name when you want them to look at you," and he did look at her. "I have been managing this store and this life and this fight with Denton and my grief for my father since April. I have been doing it competently and I will continue doing it competently. I am not looking for an asset. I am telling you I would like you to stay." A pause. "Because when you are here the air is different." He looked at her for a long time. "The air is different for me too," he said. She smiled, and it was the full version of the smile that had been interrupted on Tuesday, and it was worth the wait. "Then stay," she said simply. "I'll stay," he said. The following week was the most natural week Ezekiel had spent in 11 years. He had not understood, during all the months and years of drifting, how much of his energy had been consumed by the continuous act of moving, the packing and the writing and the perpetual assessment of unfamiliar towns. How much of himself he had spent simply on the mechanics of going nowhere in particular. Stopping that, even for a week, released something in him that he had not known was being held. He worked with Hazel in the store each day, learning the rhythms and regulars. He learned which customers needed patience, and which ones needed efficiency, and which ones were lonely and needed to be talked to for 3 minutes more than strictly necessary. He learned the inventory well enough to anticipate reorders. He repaired 3 more things around the building that had been waiting for someone with the time to address them. He spent an evening reworking the store's account ledger into a format that was more efficient to update, and presented it to Hazel the next morning with a slight nervousness about whether she would feel he had overstepped, and she studied it for 2 minutes and said, "This is better, thank you," and pulled up the stool and started entering the week's figures. On Thursday evening, Patterson's formal response arrived from Austin. A certified state document confirming every detail Crow had already verbally established, but in writing with the state seal, the kind of document that ended conversations permanently. Hazel read it at the kitchen table and set it down carefully and put her face in her hands for just a moment, not crying, just allowing herself to feel the weight of what she had been carrying and the relief of setting it down. Ezekiel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time, and neither of them needed to say anything, and it was enough. 2 weeks after he arrived, Denton sent a representative to the store, a lawyer from Abilene who stated without preamble that his client wished to make an offer on the property. Hazel listened to the offer politely. The number was fair market value. "Thank you," she said, with the same tone she had used the first day with the axe in her hand. "My client is prepared to go above market value," the lawyer said. "I appreciate his continued interest," Hazel said pleasantly. "But this store was my father's life's work and it will continue to be my life's work, and I do not plan to sell it to Roy Denton or anyone else. Please tell him so and thank him for his time." The lawyer looked at Ezekiel, who was standing near the back wall saying nothing. "Is this gentleman a business partner?" the lawyer asked. "This gentleman," Hazel said with perfect composure, "is Ezekiel Rhodes. You may relay his name to your client along with my answer." The lawyer left. Hazel turned to Ezekiel, and there was a fierce light in her eyes that was part triumph and part something else, something that looked at him openly and without pretense. "Thank you for not speaking," she said. "It was your decision to make," he said. "I just stood there." "You stood there very well," she said. He crossed the room to her in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her, finally, with all the care and gravity of a man who has not kissed anyone in 11 years and knows it, and does not want to rush it. She kissed him back with both hands on his chest, and the afternoon fell quiet around them. When they separated, she was looking at him with a softness that she did not bother to hide. "You have been trying to say goodbye to me since Tuesday the first week," she said. "I have," he admitted. "I don't want you to say it. I know," he let out a long breath. "Hazel, I have to tell you something that I don't know how to say without it being a serious thing." "Then say it seriously." "I have not made a home in 11 years," he said. "I don't know fully yet what I am without the moving. And I don't want to promise you something I don't know I can keep, but I want to learn. I want to find out who I am when I'm standing still. And he stopped. Then, plainly, I want to find out here. With you? She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon was very still. That is enough for me, she said. That is exactly enough. He did not leave. November came to Clearwater with its full weight, the temperatures dropping and the plains going gray and brown under a wide, cold sky. Ezekiel found lodgings at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Carver, who charged him a fair rate and kept a clean house and did not ask too many personal questions, which Ezekiel appreciated. He was at the store every day, and Hazel came to the boarding house for Sunday suppers that Mrs. Carver began setting an extra place for without being asked. The town took note, as small towns do. Most of the response was friendly, because Hazel was well-liked and the circumstances of Ezekiel's arrival, standing up to Denton on her behalf, had been witnessed and were now part of the local story that people told each other. A few people were guarded or skeptical, because he was a stranger and men who drifted had unpredictable natures in the general folklore. Ezekiel did not try to change anyone's opinion. He simply did what he did, helped where he could, was honest when asked direct questions, and let the rest accumulate at its own pace. He found work of a more formalized kind when he helped rancher Baxter, and two of his hands solve a problem with a fence line that had been disputed between Baxter's property and a neighboring claim. Ezekiel spent 2 days surveying the actual line using skills he had picked up in a Colorado mining season, and produced a clear map that resolved the disagreement without involving lawyers. Baxter paid him generously and told 2 other people, and by the end of November Ezekiel had enough work from various property owners and business people in the area that he was something between a surveyor and a general problem solver, and he was earning enough to pay his board and set some aside. He wrote letters, carefully composed and sent through the formal registry mail, to 3 lawyers in San Antonio and Austin, about whether any of them needed a literate, experienced man with surveying skills and frontier knowledge who was now stationary. He received 2 responses in December that were promising. In December the first snow came, brief and light, a dusting that turned the streets white overnight and melted by noon. Hazel opened the store that morning to find Ezekiel had already cleared the front steps and the porch. She stood in the door and looked at him where he was finishing the last of it, his breath making clouds in the cold air, his hat pulling low against the chill. "Good morning," she said. He looked up and smiled at her, a full, real smile that came easily, which she noticed because she had watched it become easier over the weeks, the way the sky lightens gradually toward morning without you being able to identify the exact moment the dark becomes something else. They had dinner that evening at the small restaurant that ran out of the Clearwater Hotel, which was the first time they had gone somewhere together that was distinctly and undeniably a thing 2 people did when they were courting. The owner, a short, cheerful man named Hendricks, gave them a table by the window and kept their coffee cups full, and made himself scarce with the professional instinct of someone who recognized an important occasion. Ezekiel wore his good shirt, the blue one that he had acquired in a general store in Albuquerque 3 years ago, and had barely worn since because there had been no occasion for it. Hazel wore a dark green dress that did things with the color of her eyes that made it difficult to think clearly, and she had put her hair up differently than usual, loosely, with some of it escaping in a way that was likely not accidental. They talked for 3 hours. About things they had not yet said, about the future in the tentative but earnest way of 2 people who are beginning to believe one is possible, about what the store might become as Clearwater grew, about whether he would eventually formalize the survey and consulting work into an actual business, about things they each wanted that they had stopped articulating because they had stopped expecting them. "I wanted children," she said, quietly, over the coffee that was now actually cold. "I still want that. I know it requires," she stopped, smiled at herself slightly. "I know it's a future conversation. I just wanted you to know it's part of the picture I carry." "It's part of mine too," he said. "I had let go of it, but it's there." She looked at him across the small table, and everything that needed to be understood between them in that moment was understood. Walking back through the cold December street, she put her hand through his arm, and he covered it with his other hand, and they walked that way past the church and the livery and the store with its dark windows, their breath meeting in small clouds in the clear night air. At her door he kissed her again, more slowly this time, with December cold around them and the specific intimacy of standing in a doorway at night with someone who matters. When they separated, she touched his face in the way she had the first week, her palm against his jaw, and he turned his face into it slightly. "Merry Christmas early," he said, because it was the 16th of December and there were 8 days to go, but it felt like something worth saying now. "Stay for Christmas," she said. "Wild horses," he said, which was not a full sentence but was complete. Christmas in Clearwater was a genuine community occasion, with a gathering at the church and a dinner on the main street organized by the women's committee that Hazel helped lead. There were families and single men and Mexican families from the ranches south of town, and a freedman's family, the Jacksons, who had been farming a small property northeast of town since the war, and who Hazel treated with the same unaffected equality her father had, which Ezekiel marked and admired. He gave Hazel a small gift, a pocket compass in a brass case that he had found at the general store in Abilene when he had ridden there for a supply run the week before Christmas. It was practical and it had a beauty to it, the needle perfectly balanced, the case engraved with a simple compass rose. She turned it over in her hands and then looked up at him. "For finding your way," he said. "I know my way," she said, and looked at him directly as she said it so that it meant more than one thing. She gave him a new hat, dark brown, properly fitted, better quality than anything he had been wearing. She had somehow measured his old one without him noticing, and the fit was exact. He put it on and she tilted her head and looked at him the way someone looks at something they are deeply pleased by. And Mrs. Garza, who was watching from approximately 8 feet away, made a sound of profound approval that made 3 people around her turn to look. January and February were the hardest months, the cold settling in fully, and the days short and gray. But there was a quality to those months that Ezekiel would remember afterward as among the richest of his life, the particular warmth of being somewhere when it is cold outside, of having a place that is yours, of building something in the small, sustained ways that amount to a life. He formalized his survey work in February, filing a business registration at the county courthouse as E. Rhodes Land Survey and Consulting. He rented a small office above the hardware store, 2 rooms with a south-facing window that let in the winter light, and installed a proper drafting table that he had saved 3 months to buy. One morning in February, standing at that drafting table working on a property survey for a new family homesteading east of town, he was struck with a sudden absolute certainty, the kind that does not announce itself but arrives already complete. He stood at the table with the pen in his hand and the certainty sitting in his chest like a warm stone, and he thought, "This is where I stay, not just Clearwater, here, this life, this woman." He finished the survey. Then he walked downstairs and across the street to Townsend General Mercantile and came through the door, and Hazel was behind the counter entering figures in the ledger he had reorganized in October, and she looked up at him the way she always did, with the specific quality of attention that was still, after 4 months, capable of undoing him. "I need to talk to you," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Good talk or difficult talk?" "The best kind," he said. She put down the pen and came around the counter, and they went into the kitchen, because important conversations happened in kitchens. He did not have a ring. He had not had time to go to Abilene, and he knew that what he was about to do was perhaps not in the perfect sequence that occasions like this traditionally demanded, but he also knew that he had been drifting for 11 years, and the lesson of all those years was that the perfect moment was not coming if you kept waiting for it. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me." I know I came through your door in October without anything to offer except myself, and I know I'm still building what comes next, but I want to build it here with you. I want to be here tomorrow and the year after that and for every year after that. I want a home with you, Hazel." She was looking at him very steadily. Her eyes were bright. "The compass rose," she said softly. "Every direction leads somewhere. You gave me that." "You gave it back to me," he said. "You gave me back the idea of north." She came forward and took both his hands in hers. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. What took you so long?" He laughed, and it was a real, full laugh that he could feel in his whole chest. And she was laughing too. And he pulled her to him and held her, and she held him back. And the February kitchen was warm, and the town went about its life outside the window, and everything had been decided. They were married in March, in the Clearwater church, on a morning when the first tentative green was beginning to show through the winter-brown grass of the plain, and the sky had that particular pale blue of early spring, optimistic and wide. The church was full, because Hazel was known and loved, and because Ezekiel had become, in 5 months, a fixture in the town's daily life in ways that had been noticed. Mrs. Garza sat in the front row and wept with such satisfaction that it was almost congratulatory. Rancher Baxter stood as Ezekiel's witness, which was a gesture of genuine endorsement from a man who did not make those gestures lightly. Hazel wore a dress she had made herself from ivory fabric she had ordered from the catalog in January, and she walked to the front of the church with her head up and her eyes steady. And when she arrived beside Ezekiel and he turned to look at her, he felt all 11 years of going nowhere fall away from him like road dust in rain. They said their vows in the clear, practical language of people who mean every word, and when the preacher had finished and the small congregation was making its appreciative noise, Ezekiel took her hand and they walked out into the March sunshine, and the world was new. The reception was in the street, long tables of food contributed by half the town, the kind of community generosity that only existed where people had chosen to build something together in a hard place. There was music from a fiddle player named Tom Cole who could play for 6 hours without repeating himself, and dancing on the flat boards that had been laid over the dirt, and the afternoon went long and golden and full. Late in the evening, when the party was beginning to settle into its last contented stage, Ezekiel found himself standing at the edge of it, watching Hazel dance with old Mrs. Garza, the two of them moving in a slow circle while Garza talked and Hazel laughed at whatever was being said. The lamplight was on them and the music was easy, and the night was full of the good noise of people being happy, and he stood there and knew himself to be standing still, and the knowing was not loss but its opposite. He thought about Clara because he always would, and because the love he had carried for her had not diminished to make room for Hazel. It had simply taught him what love was and left him capable of it again. He thought she would have wanted this for him. He thought she would have liked Hazel, which was a thing he had thought carefully and believed completely. Hazel caught his eye across the space and smiled at him, a specific smile that was only his, and held out her hand. He went to her. They moved into the room above the store that spring. There was enough space, and being in the same building meant being able to hear the store in the mornings and feel connected to the life that was already established there. Ezekiel kept his office above the hardware store for the survey work, and the work continued to grow, because the county was growing and new families were homesteading, and every one of them needed their land lines established. He hired a young man named Will Garrett in the summer, 19 years old and mathematically gifted, who turned out to be one of the best decisions Ezekiel had made in his professional life. Will was fast, accurate, and enthusiastic in a way that reminded Ezekiel of being young and believing the work in front of you was worth doing. The store thrived too. Hazel expanded the dry goods line in the spring, responding to the growing population's need for a wider range of household supplies, and she hired a part-time assistant, a woman named Ruth Chambers who was 22, recently widowed and quietly formidable in her efficiency. The two women worked together in a complementary way that made the store run more smoothly than it ever had before. Denton made one more approach in April, through a different intermediary this time, and Hazel said no again with the same calm certainty, and this time there was no follow-up. The state documentation was in place, and the situation was settled. Denton eventually turned his attention to other acquisitions and other towns, because men like him did not stop but could be made to redirect, and in Clearwater, there was nothing left for him to redirect toward. The summer was hot in the way that Texas summers are hot, a full and committed heat that baked the plains gold and made the work of the afternoon slow and careful. Ezekiel and Hazel fell into the rhythms of a shared life, with the ease of two people who had each been shaped enough by experience to understand what mattered. They argued sometimes, the way people who are honest with each other argue, about practical things and occasionally about larger things, and they resolved those arguments with the same directness they brought to everything else. In late August, Hazel told him she was carrying their child. She told him at the kitchen table in the evening with supper cooling between them, and she told him with a directness that did not hide either her joy or her awareness of what it meant, the vulnerability and the magnitude of it. She watched his face as she said it. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hands in both of his, and his throat was tight in a way that he did not try to manage, and he looked at her and said, "Hazel, thank you." She put her other hand over his. "We're going to be good at this," she said, and it was not a prediction so much as a resolution, something they were committing to together. "Yes," he said, "we are, Mrs." Garza, upon being informed, immediately began producing quantities of hand-sewn infant clothing that suggested she had been preparing for this eventuality since October of the previous year, which she neither confirmed nor denied when asked. The winter passed quietly. Hazel remained active and working through most of it, managing the store and managing him, because he became, she pointed out with some amusement, rather overprotective in a way that required managing. He was aware of this and tried to be useful rather than fussy, which was a distinction he did not always successfully maintain. The baby arrived in late March, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding, in the way that seemed to fit the story they were living. He was a boy, solid and loud and healthy, with dark hair that came from his father and hazel eyes that came from his mother, and a particular quality of presence that had them both, independently, looking at him in the first minutes and thinking he was the most extraordinary thing they had ever seen. Which was not original as thoughts went, but had never in the history of the world been less true. They named him Thomas James Rhodes, after Hazel's father, which made Mrs. Garza weep again and made Rancher Baxter, who came to see the baby with a hat full of respect in his manner, nod in the solemn way of a man genuinely moved. Thomas James Rhodes turned out to be a person of strong opinions from very early on, which surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness and a quality of curiosity about the world that sent him investigating everything he could reach and several things he could not, from the time he was mobile enough to act on his interests. The spring of 1885 brought the railroad through 40 miles north of Clearwater, which was close enough to send a tremor of change through the town. A new road was built connecting Clearwater to the railroad junction, and with it came a new round of commercial energy, new families, new arguments about growth and character, and what kind of town they were building. Hazel expanded the store again, adding a third section and taking on a second full-time assistant. Ezekiel's business grew proportionally, because every new property claim and every new commercial building needed surveying. He hired another surveyor that fall, a man named Diego Herrera, who had been doing informal survey work for the Mexican ranching families south of town for years without proper recognition or compensation, and whose skills Ezekiel had observed in 2 different situations and found to be excellent. Diego joined the operation with the particular dignity of a man who has been underestimated for a long time and is not surprised to find it happening again, but who is glad to be working with someone who sees clearly. Ezekiel was aware, in all of this, of the injustices that shaped the world around him. The way Diego's skills had gone unrecognized because of his name. The way the Jackson family's land rights were perpetually precarious despite their legal standing. The way the Comanche and Apache peoples who had once lived across all of this land had been driven from it by force and policy that benefited everyone who was now building a life on the plains. He could not fix all of it. He could be fair in what he controlled, could ensure that his business dealt squarely with everyone regardless of their origins, could support the things Hazel supported, which included a great deal of the daily quiet work of community that made places livable for people who were not rich or powerful. It was not enough. He knew that. But it was what he had to give, and he gave it without exemption. In the fall of 1885, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, Ezekiel was standing in front of Townsend General Mercantile watching Thomas, now 18 months old and tremendously confident in his physical abilities, attempting to navigate the porch steps. Hazel was inside behind the counter, visible through the window, talking to a customer and simultaneously watching her son through the glass with the particular peripheral awareness that mothers develop automatically. It was 2 years, almost to the week, since Ezekiel had first ridden into Clearwater. He stood in the October afternoon and felt the sun on his face, and listened to his son narrate the steps in the enthusiastic private language of the not yet verbal, and watched through the window the specific way his wife moved and spoke and existed in her space, which was one of the things he never stopped noticing about her. He thought about 11 years of Dust Rhodes. He thought about the morning he had woken up in this very town and told himself he was only stopping for water. He thought about the sound of her voice cutting through the October air 2 years ago, and the way he had turned around when he had absolutely intended not to. Thomas reached the bottom step with enormous satisfaction and turned to look at his father for approval. Ezekiel crouched down to his son's level and said, "Good job, Tom." Thomas considered this praise and decided it was adequate and turned back to the steps with a view toward ascending them, which was clearly the next objective. The door to the store opened and Hazel came out having finished with her customer, and she stood behind Ezekiel with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, looking at their son tackle the steps in reverse. "He'll climb everything in the county by the time he's 2, she said. "He comes by it honestly," Ezekiel said. She squeezed his shoulder. "Are you going to the Baxter property tomorrow? Morning, back by evening." "Good." A pause. She was quiet in the particular way of a person who is about to say something and is choosing the moment for it. "I think Thomas is going to have someone to argue with before long," she said. Ezekiel went very still for just a moment. Then he turned his head to look up at her. She was looking at him with that specific expression, the one that was equal parts certainty and joy and the awareness of how much it meant. "Hazel," he said softly. "Spring again," she said. "Apparently we have a preference for spring." He stood up and turned and put his arms around her there on the porch in the October afternoon, with Thomas at their feet conquering the first step with a triumphant sound, and the town of Clearwater going about its business around them, and the plains golden and wide in every direction under a sky that went on forever. "I have been thinking," he said into her hair, "about writing to Clara's grave. Not going. Just writing. It feels like something I ought to do. Tell her about you, tell her about Thomas." She pulled back slightly to look at him. Her eyes were full. "She'd be glad," she said. "I believe she would," he said. Thomas, having successfully achieved the first step, announced this achievement in a volume appropriate to the significance of the event, and they both looked down at him, and the looking at him was the same for both of them, the same warmth, the same pride, the same tender amazement at the fact of him. Ezekiel wrote the letter to Clara's grave that evening. He wrote it at the kitchen table where he had first looked at Hazel's debt documentation by lamplight 2 years ago, and he wrote it as honestly as he knew how. He told her about 11 years of nothing stopping him. He told her about a Tuesday afternoon in October, and a woman with an axe in her hand and hazel eyes that saw clearly. He told her about a boy named Thomas, who had her dark hair and his mother's eyes, and the particular quality of determined joy that seemed to come from both his parents combined. He told her that he was sorry for all the years he had spent going nowhere, and that he understood now that the years had not been wasted so much as they had been the road between that life and this one, and that this one was a life she would have recognized as a good one, built on work and honesty and love. He folded the letter and sealed it, and the next morning, before the town was fully awake, he rode out to the edge of the plain and buried it under a flat stone with a compass rose he scratched in the surface, and stood there for a while with the early light coming across the grass and the smell of the October morning clear and cold around him. He had no grief left that was not also gratitude. He had not known that was possible, and he was glad he had lived long enough to find out. He rode back into Clearwater and put Cinder in the livery, which Cinder endured with the philosophical acceptance of an animal who had decided, in the way of horses who pay attention, that this was home, and walked up the main street to the store. Hazel was unlocking the front door as he came up the porch steps. "Early," she said. "I had something to do," he said. She looked at him and did not ask further, because she could see in his face that it had been something good, something settled. She opened the door and they went inside together into the familiar smell of flower and pine, and the specific warm air of the place they had built. And Thomas was awake upstairs and making his morning opinions known, and the day was beginning. The second baby arrived in late April of 1886, a girl this time, small and fierce, with auburn hair that clearly came from her mother and her father's dark eyes, and a voice that could make itself heard from the other end of the store, which was going to be useful, everyone agreed, if she ever went into the family business. They named her Clara Louise Rhodes, and when Ezekiel held her for the first time, standing in the upstairs room with the spring light through the window and Hazel watching him from the bed, the name felt like something complete and right, a joining of the two lives that had made this one possible. Thomas was fascinated by his sister in the way of 2-year-olds who are not entirely sure whether the new development is an improvement but are keeping an open mind. He studied her with the serious thoroughness of a person conducting an investigation, and Mrs. Garza, who was present because she was always present for these events, told him that he was a very important brother now, and that this was a great responsibility, and he appeared to find this framing acceptable. Ezekiel stood in the middle of all of it, in his home, in his town, in his life, with his wife recovering in the next room and his son working on some architectural project near the window and his new daughter, asleep in his arms with the total confidence of someone who has arrived somewhere safe. He stood in it and let himself know it fully, the way you let yourself know something when you have spent a long time not being able to. He had been drifting for 11 years with no reason to stop. He had stopped on a Tuesday afternoon in October, in the middle of a street in Clearwater, Texas, because a woman with hazel eyes had held her ground against a man who wanted to take something from her, and he had turned around when he should have kept walking, and everything had followed from that like water finding the channel it was always going to run. The survey business continued to grow through 1886 and into 1887. By the time the railroad spur reached Clearwater itself in the summer of 1887, Ezekiel had 3 surveyors working under him and a reputation across 3 counties as a man whose maps could be trusted absolutely. He was offered a position with the county assessor's office that fall, which he declined, because he preferred the independence of his own practice, but he took on a consulting role that gave him a formal relationship with county government without surrendering control of his time. Thomas at 3 was exactly what everyone had predicted, a child of maximum ambition and impressive physical courage who kept both his parents at full alert. Clara Louise, at 1, was already in possession of a personality that combined her mother's directness with a quality of serene confidence in her own importance that was entirely original. The house above the store was beginning to feel appropriately full, which was not the same as crowded and was, in fact, one of the best feelings Ezekiel had encountered. In the fall of 1887, 4 years after that October Tuesday, Ezekiel built the house. It was on a lot 2 streets from the store, large enough for the family and for the future, built of good wood and with proper foundations, with a porch on the south side where the afternoon light fell in long strips through the fall, and a kitchen large enough to hold everyone who tended to end up in it. He did much of the work himself, with Will Garrett and Diego Herrera and rancher Baxter's 2 sons helping on the larger structures, and the whole enterprise taking 4 months of weekends and evenings. Hazel made every decision about the interior with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and the result was a house that worked, that breathed, that felt from the first day like something permanent. She planted things in the fall that would come up in spring, tulip bulbs and a rosebush along the porch rail, and a kitchen garden along the south fence. On the night they moved in, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Ezekiel and Hazel sat on the south porch in the November cold, wrapped in blankets, with coffee cups between their palms, looking at the stars over the Texas plain. "Do you remember," Hazel said, "that first night we sat on the front steps of the store, in October, right at the beginning? The coffee had gone cold," he said, "and you asked me what mattered in the last 11 years. You told me about the man in Colorado, Henry Coles, who was happy prospecting for 30 years without a strike, and you told me I was looking for something to stay for." She leaned against his shoulder. "Did you find it?" He was quiet for a moment, not because the answer was uncertain, but because the answer was large, and large things deserved their moment. "I found everything," he said. She pressed closer, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in their blankets under the enormous Texas stars, and the November cold was around them, and the warm house was behind them, and their children slept inside, and the town of Clearwater went on in its quiet night rhythms, and the plains were silver and wide in every direction, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. In the years that followed, they built a life that was full in every sense of the word. Thomas grew into a boy of extraordinary energy and genuine kindness, the kindness that comes from being raised among people who practice it, and he took to school with the same determination he took to the porch steps at 18 months, advancing through every challenge with the complete conviction that obstacles were simply steps he had not yet navigated. Clara Louise grew into herself with a personality so vivid, and decided that even her brother, who was not easily impressed, admitted she was remarkable, and she spent her earliest years treating the world with the exploratory confidence of someone who was certain it was going to turn out to be interesting. A 3rd child came in 1889, another boy, named after Ezekiel's father, a man he had not spoken of often but who had been decent in the particular working way of men who do not talk about their decency. And this boy, named Samuel, arrived with a quiet attentiveness about him that marked him from his first weeks as someone who would be a watcher before he was a talker, and a thinker before he was a doer, and who would, it seemed already, be the child who sat with you in the kitchen at night and listened to everything. The store continued to grow. By 1890, Hazel had employed 4 people full-time and had expanded into the adjacent building, which had been vacant for 2 years since its previous owner retired, and which she purchased outright with savings she had been accumulating since before Ezekiel arrived. The new section added a fabric and sewing supplies department that became one of the most popular destinations in the county for the women of the surrounding ranches and homesteads. Mrs. Garza remained a constant presence in their lives well into her 80s, arriving every Sunday after church, and eating at their table and pronouncing on everything, and everyone with the authority of someone who had been right about everything important from the beginning, and saw no reason to modulate her opinions accordingly. She died in the summer of 1891, peacefully in her own bed, with a rosary in her hand and a smile on her face that suggested she found the general state of affairs satisfactory, and Clearwater grieved her genuinely and loudly, which was the appropriate response. Hazel and Ezekiel sat together on the south porch the evening after the funeral, as they had so many evenings before and would so many evenings after, and talked about her the way you talk about people who have been real presences in your life and left it richer. "She loved you from the first minute," Hazel said. "She had decided about me before I opened my mouth," Ezekiel said, with the particular affection of a man who appreciated being decided about favorably. "She told me in the first week," Hazel said. "She smiled. She said that man is going to stop running and he is going to stop here. She said she could see it in his boots." Ezekiel looked at her. "His boots?" "A man who is done running," she said, "stands differently in his boots, more weight in the heel." She looked at him with warm eyes. "She was right, of course." "She was right about everything," he said. "She really was," Hazel said, and leaned against him, and he held her in the summer evening while the fireflies began their brief, beautiful work in the yard below the porch, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and the years lay behind them like good road, and the years ahead lay open and certain and full. Ezekiel Rhodes had been a drifter for 11 years, going nowhere in every direction, carrying the weight of loss like a stone he could not put down. He had ridden into 100 towns meaning to ride out again, and he had ridden out again every time, because there had been nothing to hold him, nothing to argue against the particular gravity of motion that had become his entire way of being. And then one Tuesday afternoon in October, in a town called Clearwater, Texas, a woman had held her ground with an axe in her hand, and said words that cut through the dry autumn air with the clarity of something true, and he had turned around. He had turned around, and she had asked his name, and he had given it, and she had given hers, and somewhere in the hours that followed, in the flower and pine smell of her store and the warm light of her kitchen and the steady courage of her eyes, something in him had decided below the level of conscious choice that this was where the road ended. Not ended like stopping, not ended like giving up, ended like arriving. He had arrived and he had stayed, and the staying had given him back everything the 11 years of moving had been the absence of: a place, a purpose. A woman who was brave and honest and impossible to fool, who worked hard and loved fiercely and saw him as he actually was without blinking. Children who were growing up into people he admired already, which was a thing he had not known would feel the way it felt, like watching something you helped build do exactly what it was designed to do, fully and beautifully. The town of Clearwater grew around them through the closing years of the 19th century, the railroad spur bringing new commerce and new people and new arguments about what the future should look like, and Ezekiel and Hazel were part of those arguments, were part of the town's life at its foundation level, were known and relied on and loved by the people they had chosen to be among. He never drifted again. He had no reason to. On a September evening in 1892, with the children in their beds and the house settling into its night quiet, he sat at the kitchen table writing out the week's survey contracts, and Hazel sat across from him with a book, and the lamp was between them the way it had always been, since the very first night she had poured coffee and he had read her documentation, and they had discovered together the ease of sharing a room. He put down his pen and looked at her. She looked up from her book, knowing without anything being said that she was being looked at in a particular way. "What?" she said softly. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She smiled, that specific smile that was only his, the one she had given him when he first arrived and had never stopped giving him, and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. And outside the window the Texas night was wide and starlit and full, and Ezekiel Rhodes was home,